Hello, good morning. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk with all of you this morning about the policy and economic landscape that really does set the context for the discussions we're going to have this legislative session and throughout the year about investing in our children and youth. Certainly there's been greater attention and perhaps well overdue attention in the public dialogue to the economic insecurity faced by so many across our state and our nation. Clearly, one of the central challenges of these times is figuring out how to bring economic opportunity to all, regardless of who they are or where they live. Our future economic success as a state depends on more Minnesotans reaching their full potential in education and in the labor market. And while we don't yet have agreement about how to do that, I do believe there's common ground that we must be working hard to expand opportunity and prosperity in our state and in our nation. And as Frank mentioned, another characteristic of the moment that we're in is the prominence of federal issues. It is certain that federal policy changes will have a big impact, both on our budget and on the people of our state. But there is a lot of uncertainty about what the details are about those changes. So this morning I'm going to lay out for you some of the potential federal changes that could have the greatest impact on our state, as well as the state budget context for responding to those changes. This session, Minnesota policymakers will decide how to invest in our young people when they set the state budget for the next 2 years. They will determine how much will go to schools, to child care, to health care, for services for children in need of protection, and many other areas of our state budget where it touches the lives of our children and youth. Another way that they can support our children and families is through tax policy. For example, expanding the working family tax credit would better enable Minnesota parents working at lower incomes to support their families and get their kids off to a good start, and would also help our young people succeed as they start their working lives. Expanding the child and dependent care tax credit would put affordable child care within reach for more Minnesota families. Those are areas included in the governor's budget. He's been a great leader on those issues and have received bipartisan support in the past, so we're optimistic about the opportunities there. Those tax and budget decisions will be made in a context of divided government, and policymakers will need to find common ground because we only can get a budget in place when the legislature and the governor agree about what that budget will look like. Those state budget discussions will also be informed by the state's economic and budget forecast. The most recent forecast came out in December, called the November forecast, comes out in December. It projected that Minnesota will have a $1.4 billion surplus for the upcoming budget cycle, so that's the 18-19 biennium that they'll be setting the budget for. To put that in perspective, that's about 3% of the overall size of the budget. So not a gigantic surplus, but definitely there are some resources available to make some additional investments in the state. I do have to warn you, those are only projections, it's not a guarantee, and the forecast was done before the election, and it does not anticipate the impact of any federal changes on the state budget or on the economy. So we'll turn now to the federal level. Those of you who have seen me before may be surprised there is only one chart or graph that I will show you today. Here it is. This is the federal budget. And we can think about the federal budget in a couple of different ways. And the reason I'm showing this slide is because there's a number of ways that federal changes could impact the state. And what we're particularly looking at are where are the federal decisions that could take a bite out of the resources that Minnesota uses to provide essential services, and what are some of the policy changes that would create additional challenges for our kids and our families. So the kinds of federal changes that could do that include cuts in federal funding to states, cuts or major revisions to federal state safety net programs, federal tax changes, and then other kinds of policy changes that impact people's lives, such as immigration policy. So in this pie chart, federal funding, you can think about that in two categories. The first being mandatory or entitlements, that includes Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and other mandatory spending includes things like SNAP or food stamps. And then discretionary, often thought of as divided into defense and then either non-defense or domestic. And that includes that non-defense domestic discretionary piece of the pie and covers a wide range of services, includes education, Head Start, child care, rental assistance, a whole number of things that touch on families in the state. Federal funding makes up about a quarter of state budgets overall, so when the federal government makes major decisions, that really has an effect at us down at the state level. State and local governments receive funding from three pieces of this budget pie: from Medicaid, from other mandatory spending, and domestic discretionary. And all three of those pie pieces are facing major changes and cuts. A big theme we really are needing to keep our eye out for is when the federal government cuts its share of funding for low-income assistance and other programs, and then shifts the responsibility to the state, but with fewer resources. States just don't have the order of magnitude to make up when the federal government makes major changes, and that can lead to real harm to the people federal programs are meant to help. Okay. Health is the largest area of federal funding for states, and clearly we are facing large changes there. I want to point out that since the Affordable Care Act went into effect, the percentage of Minnesota kids without health insurance dropped to 3.1%. Yeah, it's great progress. Unfortunately, the process of repealing the Affordable Care Act has already started. What's likely to be repealed or eliminated includes federally funded expansion of health care under Medicaid, tax credits that reduce the cost of private health insurance premiums, and also being eliminated is much or all of the revenues that paid for the Affordable Care Act. What's very unclear is what is going to replace it and on what timeline. But when we've looked at some of the replacement plans that Congress has considered in the past, the analysis is that the number of Minnesotans without health insurance would more than double, and Minnesota could lose more than $16 billion over a 10-year period. So we all need to be watching closely about what's happening there. The ACA is not the only major change to health care that is being considered on the federal level. Medicaid also could see major changes in terms of becoming a block grant or through something called a per capita cap. I won't get geeky about what's the difference between those two things, but what they have in common is that Medicaid would no longer be available for all those who qualify and need it. Instead, the federal government would provide a fixed amount of funding for that kind of health care to states. And under all the recent proposals along these lines that we've seen, the funding for states is set below what is currently provided. It's set below what's needed to provide those services, and it falls further and further behind as time goes by. That will create pressure on states to figure out how to make up the difference, and that tends to look like limiting the kinds of people who can qualify for that health care or the kinds of health care services they can receive. It can increase costs to the low-income people participating in that healthcare program, and it also can result in cuts in payments to healthcare providers. And to put it in perspective for kids, more than 500,000 Minnesota kids get healthcare through Medicaid or through CHIP, and CHIP is facing similar challenges. Other safety net programs that we're keeping our eye on includes SNAP, formerly called food stamps. There are some looking at the federal level on SNAP. Again, a block grant is one of the things they're looking at. You know, right now, SNAP lifts more children out of deep poverty than any other government program, and we really see a return on that investment because kids with access to SNAP do better years down the road in terms of their health and in terms of their education. Turning to the discretionary spending side of the budget, so that includes education, particularly for low-income children and children with disabilities, Head Start, nutrition through WIC, a whole series of social services and other investments. That is an area of the budget that is already capped under current federal law, and under the decisions that have already been made is expected to reach a record low level of funding as a share of the economy in 2018 and projected to fall further. But there is likely to be pressure for additional cuts as there is a desire on the federal level to increase funding in the defense budget that creates pressure on the domestic discretionary side. So whatever the specific changes in federal funding will be for healthcare, for other parts of the safety net, for discretionary spending, Minnesota state policymakers will have to decide how to respond to the loss of federal funds and the loss of federal services to Minnesota residents. We'll need to decide, can we use some state resources to fill in the gaps? Unfortunately, our ability to respond and fill in the gaps may also be impacted by federal tax changes. Much of our state-level tax system builds off of the federal income tax or corporate tax system, and so sometimes when there's changes that are made at the federal level, it really does erode our ability potentially to raise revenues at the state level. So that's something that policymakers will be needing to pay attention to as well. And then finally, I do want to mention then there's other kinds of federal policy changes that don't directly touch on the state's budget, but do impact our families, children and youth, including immigration policy changes and weakening of job and wage standards. The decision-making timeline for these federal changes is not particularly clear. I have a great deal of sympathy for our Minnesota state policymakers that they're going to be making decisions about our budget this year. They need to get that done by the end of May, and I don't think we'll know all the details of what's happening on the federal level by then. Some of this we'll respond to in 2017, and some of it more an issue for 2018. So I know the scope of what's in front of us is sobering. We could see some really significant changes in federal investments and perhaps facing some of the most dramatic changes I've seen in about 20 years of doing this work. So it really is a moment that requires us all to be engaged, both in informing the federal decision and the state's response. The good news is that Minnesota does have a tradition of innovation and of charting a Minnesota-specific course in response to federal changes. We all have a role to play in building on those things that Minnesota does well, and to confront the truths about where we need to do better, and particularly making sure that the opportunities this state offers is available to everyone. It's really time for us to work together to set a path for our state that invests in our young people and enables them to thrive. If we do that, we'll be investing in the future success of our state. Thank you.